Serving as a compensation committee chair or as a compensation committee member has become an increasingly challenging task. Many of the committee's decisions can have significant ramifications on the company and receive scrutiny from investors, proxy advisors, and even employees. Good governance of executive compensation requires a balance between creating shareholder value, motivating desired behaviors among executives, and managing potential risks. So Chris, what are some of the processes you've used with your committees to make sure that you have good governance in place?
One of the best processes that I see at most of my committees is an approach that they call 2 bites at the apple. What this really means is that if decisions are non-routine, so it's a change to an incentive plan program or something more complex, they make sure that they consider the issue over at least 2 meetings. So the first meeting, management would tee up the issue, provide material, some alternatives, advantages and disadvantages of the different alternatives. The committee would then use that meeting to provide some directional feedback to management, whether they're directionally aligned, whether they have a preference for one alternative over another, and also use that as an opportunity to request more information if they think they need more information to make a fully informed decision. At the second meeting, then with that additional information, with a much more refined proposal from management, ideally much more specific, the compensation committee would then make its decision. It has the advantage then of having had that opportunity and that period of time to reflect and to consider the decisions that it's making and the potential consequences of those decisions. So I think that process is really helpful. We can see how that process works with the regular approval of the annual incentive plan. At the first meeting, management would introduce potential incentive metrics and incentive plan structure. At the second meeting, the measures and structure would be finalized and approved by the committee. And at that same meeting, management would introduce how it proposes to set threshold, target, and maximum performance levels. Then at the third meeting, because we really have a rolling 2 bites at the apple here, performance targets would be finalized and the awards would be approved. All of this, of course, requires a fair bit of coordination between the committee chair, management, and the committee's consultant. How do you manage keeping all of these parties rowing in the same direction?
Sure. You know, the compensation committee chair, the management team, and myself as the comp consultant really have to come together and work as a team in order to prepare for a compensation committee meeting. And one of the most critical success factors to making sure that a meeting goes smoothly is to make sure there's no surprises when we get in that meeting. We all need to know where each other is coming from. There should be no surprise around position, around materials, or any of those types of items. So if there is a breakdown in preparation for a committee meeting, it usually shows up as a surprise in the meeting itself, which is why I like to spend a lot of time making sure that we prepare appropriately for the committee meeting well in advance. The first step of that is really starts 8 to 10 weeks prior to the committee meeting, where we confirm the agenda with the compensation committee chair and the management team. This can be a call, it might be an email, but it's a time to come together, review the agenda, make sure that we've got any special items on the agenda that need to be there, make sure we're getting input from the committee chair around expectations of materials, expectations of what kind of analytics they want to see. I mean, also making sure we understand the expectations around communication. How do they want to be communicated with? What's appropriate to communicate with management versus the chair? The next step is a step of collaboration. We go off, we have to work on some things by ourselves. Many times the management team is also leading certain pieces of materials, but we need to collaborate, we need to work together to be able to develop quality materials. So there needs to be consistent communication back and forth, and just clear communication between those parties. And there also might need to be a check-in occasionally back with the chair to make sure that, again, that we're meeting expectations. We may have questions along the way. The next step after that is the pre-meeting or the pre-call. And this is usually 2 to 3 weeks in advance. This is where we go through the draft materials, and it is very important that those materials are basically final. We don't want kind of semi-complete drafts. We want the committee chair to be able to review the drafts, provide input, redirect us, and give us some time to maybe redo materials if there is some redirection, but provide input and ask questions along the way. And then also there might be a need occasionally for a separate call with just ourselves and the committee chair if there's some items where it might not be appropriate to have the management team involved. And then, of course, the final step is the posting of those materials, which really needs to happen at least a week prior to the committee meeting to give the committee full opportunity to review those materials before they get into the meeting itself. So this is a relatively simple process, but if you just consistently apply it, I found that it can avoid surprises and really ensure a much more smooth kind of process once we get into the committee room and a good discussion around committee items. So, Chris, I'd be curious, what are some of the other ways that you've used as you work with committees to just make sure that there is a good communication and smooth process once you get in the committee room?
So very much aligned, Ryan, with your theme of no surprises. We like to have no surprises in the committee meeting itself. And one of the things that actually helps that is to have an executive session at every committee meeting. That executive session should be on the agenda, and it should happen whether or not anybody asks for it. You don't want your committee members to be in the position where they have to say in front of management, I've got an issue that I want to raise and I think we need to go into executive session. Some of my really good committees actually have an executive session at both the start and the end of the meeting. And they use the executive session at the start of the meeting to tee up the agenda, develop a roadmap for themselves for the meeting. The committee chair will bring the committee members up to speed on any discussions that have been going on with management or with the consultant. And sometimes even planning out what's going to be dealt with when, and sometimes which members of the management team will be in the room for which parts of the discussion. All of that really helps the meeting itself run very smoothly. This wraps up the first part of our presentation on good compensation governance process. Stay tuned for part 2, which will be posted shortly.